Hello, and welcome back to Living Pages. Tonight, we'll enjoy two stories by two different authors. We'll begin with A Midnight Visitor by John Kendrick Bangs. I do not assert that what I am about to relate is in all its particulars absolutely true. Not, understand me, that it is not true. But I do not feel that I care to make an assertion that is more than likely to be received by a skeptical age with sneers of incredulity. I will content myself with a simple narration of the events of that evening, the memory of which is so indelibly impressed upon my mind, and which, were I able to do so, I should forget without any sentiments of regret whatsoever. The affair happened on the night before I fell ill of typhoid fever, and is about the sole remaining remembrance of that immediate period left to me. Briefly, the story is as follows. Notwithstanding the fact that I was overworked in the practice of my profession, it was early in March, and I was preparing my contributions for the coming Christmas issues of the periodicals for which I write. I had accepted the highly honorable position of entertainment committeeman at one of the small clubs to which I belonged. I accepted the office, supposing that the duties connected with it were easy of performance, and with absolutely no notion that the faith of my fellow committeemen in my judgment was so strong that they would ultimately manifest a desire to leave the whole program for the club's diversion in my hands. This, however, they did. And when the month of March assumed command of the calendar, I found myself utterly fagged out and at my wits' end to know what style of entertainment to provide for the club meeting to be held on the evening of the 15th of that month. I had provided already an unusually taking variety of evenings, of which one in particular, called the Martyr's Night, in which living authors writhed through selections from their own works, while an inhuman audience, every man of whom had suffered even as the victims then suffered, sat on 10 score of camp stools, puffing the smoke of 25 score of free cigars into their faces, and gloating over their misery, was extremely successful, and had gained for me among my professional brethren the enviable title of Machiavelli Jr. This performance, in fact, was the one now uppermost in the minds of the club members, having been the most recent of the series, and it had been prophesied by many men whose judgment was unassailable that no man, not even I, could ever conceive of anything that could surpass it. Disposed at first to question the accuracy of a prophecy to the effect that I was, like most others of my kind, possessed of limitations, I came finally to believe that perhaps, after all, these male Cassandras with whom I was thrown were right. Indeed, the more I racked my brains to think of something better than the Martyr's Night, the more I became convinced that in that achievement I had reached the zenith of my powers. The thing for me to do now was to hook myself securely onto that zenith and stay there. But how to do it? That was the question which drove sleep from my eyes and deprived me for a period of 6 weeks of my reason, my hair departing immediately upon the restoration thereof, a not uncommon after symptom of typhoid. It was a typical March night, this one upon which the extraordinary incident about to be related took place. It was the kind of night that novelists use when they are handling a mystery that in the abstract would amount to nothing, but which in the concrete of a bit of wild, weird, and windy nocturnalism sends the reader into hysterics. It may be, I shall not attempt to deny it, that had it happened upon another kind of an evening, a soft, mild, balmy June evening, for instance, my own experience would have seemed less worthy of preservation in the amber of publicity. But of that, the reader must judge for themselves. The fact alone remains that upon the night when my uncanny visitor appeared, the weather department was apparently engaged in getting rid of its remnants. There was a large percentage of withering blast in the general makeup of the evening. There were rain and snow, which alternated in pattering upon my window pane and whitening the apology for a wold that stands 3 blocks from my flat on Madison Square. The wind whistled as it always does upon occasions of this sort, and from all corners of my apartment, after the usual fashion, there seemed to come sounds of a supernatural order, the effect of which was to send cold chills off on their regular trips up and down the spine of their victim. In this instance, myself. I wish that at the time the hackneyed quality of these sensations had appealed to me. That it did not do so was shown by the highly nervous state in which I found myself as my clock struck 11. If I could only have realized at that hour that these symptoms were the same old, threadbare premonitions of the appearance of a supernatural being, I should have left the house and gone to the club, and so have avoided the visitation then imminent. Had I done this, I should doubtless also have escaped the typhoid, since the doctors attributed that misfortune to the shock of my experience, which, in my then wearied state, I was unable to sustain. And what the escape of typhoid would have meant to me, only those who have seen the bills of my physician and druggist for services rendered and prescriptions compounded are aware. That my mind unconsciously took thought of spirits was shown by the fact that when the first chill came upon me, I arose and poured out for myself a stiff bumper of Old Reserve rye, which I immediately swallowed. But beyond this, I did not go. I simply sat there before my fire and cudgeled my brains for an idea whereby my fellow members at the Gutenberg Club might be amused. How long I sat there, I do not know. It may have been 10 minutes. It may have been an hour. I was barely conscious of the passing of time. But I do know that the clock in the Dutch Reformed Church steeple at 29th and 5th Avenue was clanging out the first stroke of the hour of midnight when my doorbell rang. Theretofore, if I may be allowed the word, the tintintabulation of my doorbell had been invariably pleasing unto me. I am fond of company, and company alone was betokened by its ringing, since my creditors gratify their passion for interviews at my office, if perchance they happen to find me there. But on this occasion, I could not at the moment tell why, its clanging seemed the very essence of discord. It jangled with my nervous system, and as it ceased, I was conscious of a feeling of irritability, which is utterly at variance with my nature outside of business hours. In the office, for the sake of discipline, I frequently adopt a querulous manner, finding it necessary in dealing with office boys. But the moment I leave shop behind me, I become a different individual entirely, and have been called a moteless sunbeam by those who have seen only that side of my character. This, by the way, must be regarded as a confidential communication, since I am at present engaged in preparing a vest pocket edition of the philosophical works of Schopenhauer in words of one syllable, And were it known that the publisher had entrusted the magnificent pessimism of that illustrious juggler of words and theories to a moteless sunbeam, it might seriously interfere with the sale of the work. And I may say, too, that this request that my confidence be respected is entirely disinterested, inasmuch as I decline to do the work on the royalty plan, insisting upon the payment of a lump sum, considerably in advance. But to return. I heard the bell ring with a sense of profound disgust. I did not wish to see anybody. My whiskey was low, my quinine pills few in number. My chills alone were present in a profusion bordering upon ostentation. I'll pretend not to hear it, I said to myself, resuming my work of gazing at the flickering light of my fire, which, by the way, was the only light in the room. Ting-a-ling, went the bell, as if in answer to my resolve. Confound the luck! I cried, jumping from my chair and going to the door with the intention of opening it. An intention, however, which was speedily abandoned, for as I approached it, a sickly fear came over me. A sensation I had never before known seemed to take hold of my being, and instead of opening the door, I pushed the bolt to make it more secure. There's a hint for you, whoever you are, I cried. Do you hear that bolt slide? I added tremulously from the other side. There came no reply, only a more violent ringing of the bell. See here, I called out as loudly as I could. Who are you, anyhow? What do you want? There was no answer, except from the bell, which began again. Bell wire's too cheap to steal. If you want wire, go buy it. Don't try to pull mine out. It isn't mine anyhow. It belongs to the house. Still, there was no reply, only the clanging of the bell. And then my curiosity overcame my fear, and with a quick movement, I threw open the door. Are you satisfied now? I said angrily. But I addressed an empty vestibule. There was absolutely no one there, and then I sat down on the mat and laughed. I never was so glad to see no one in my life. But my laugh was short-lived. What made the bell ring? I suddenly asked myself, and then the feeling of fear came upon me again. I gathered my somewhat shattered self together, sprang to my feet, slammed the door with such force that the corridors echoed to the sound, slid the bolt once more, turned the key, moved a heavy chair in front of it, and then fled like a frightened hare to the sideboard in my dining room. There, I grasped the decanter holding my whiskey, seized a glass from the shelf, and started to pour out the usual dram, when the glass fell from my hand and was shivered into 1,000 pieces on the hardwood floor. For, as I poured, I glanced through my open door, and there in my sanctum the flicker of a random flame divulged the form of a being, the eyes of whom seemed fixed on mine, piercing me through and through. To say that I was petrified, but dimly expresses the situation. I was granitized, and so I remained until, by a more luminous flicker from the burning wood, I perceived that the being wore a flaring red necktie. He is human, I thought, and with the thought, the tension on my nerves system relaxed, and I was able to feel sufficiently well. This is a mighty cool proceeding on your part, I said, leaving the sideboard and walking into the sanctum. Yes, he replied, in a tone that made me jump. It was so extremely sepulchral, a tone that seemed as if it might have become acquired in a damp corner of some cave off the earth. But it's a cool evening. I wonder that a man of your coolness doesn't hire himself out to some refrigerating company, I remarked with a sneer which would have delighted the soul of Cassius himself. I have thought of it, returned the being calmly, but never went any further. Summer hotel proprietors have always outbid the refrigerating people, and they in turn have been laid low by millionaires, who have hired me on occasion to freeze out people they didn't like, but who have persisted in calling. I must confess, though, my dear Haram, that you are not so much warmer yourself. This greeting is hardly what I expected. Well, if you want to make me warmer, I retorted hotly, just keep on calling me Haram. How the deuce did you know that of my blot on my echelon, anyhow? I added, for Haram was one of the crimes of my family that I had tried to conceal. My parents having fastened the name of Hiram Spencer Carrington upon me at baptism for no reason other than that my rich bachelor uncle, who subsequently failed and became a charge upon me, was so named. I was standing at the door of the church when you were baptized, returned the visitor, and as you were an interesting baby, I have kept an eye on you ever since. Of course, I knew that you discarded Haram as soon as you got old enough to put away childish things. And since the failure of your uncle, I have been aware that you desired to be known as Spencer Carrington. But to me, you are, always have been, and always will be Haram. Well, don't give it away, I pleaded. I hope to be famous someday. And if the American newspaper paragrapher ever got hold of the fact that once in my life I was Haram, I'd have to Haram to let me go. That's a bad joke, Haram, said the visitor. And for that reason, I like it. Though I don't laugh. There is no danger of you becoming famous if you stick to humor of that sort. Well, I'd like to know, I put in, my anger returning. I'd like to know who in Brincy you are, what in Cairo you want, and what in the name of the 17th hinges of the gates of Singapore you are doing here at this time of night. When you were a baby, Haram, you had blue eyes, said my visitor. Bonny blue eyes, as the poet says. What of it? I asked. This, replied my visitor. If you have them now, you can very easily see what I am doing here. I am sitting down and talking to you. Oh, are you? I said with fine scorn. I had not observed that. The fact is, my eyes were so weakened by the brilliance of that necktie of yours that I doubt I could see anything, not even one of my own jokes. It's a scorcher, that tie of yours. In fact, I never saw anything so red in my life. I do not see why you complain of my tie, said the visitor. Your own is just as bad. Blue is never so withering as red, I retorted, at the same time caressing the scarf I wore. Perhaps. But, if you will look in the glass, Haram, you will observe that your point is not well taken, said my vis-a-vis calmly. I acted upon the suggestion and looked upon my reflection in the glass, lighting a match to facilitate the operation. I was horrified to observe that my beautiful blue tie, of which I was so proud, had in some manner changed, and was now of the same aggressive hue as was that of my visitor. Red, even as a brick, is red. To grasp it firmly in my hands and tear it from my neck was the work of a moment. And then, in a spirit of rage, I turned on my companion. "See here," I cried. "I've had quite enough of you. I can't make you out, and I can't say what I want to. You know where the door is. You will oblige me by putting it to its proper use." "Sit down, Haram," said he, "and don't be foolish and ungrateful. You are behaving in a most extraordinary fashion, destroying your clothing and acting like a madman generally. What was the use of ripping up a handsome tie like that?" "I despise loud hues. Red is a jockey's color," I answered. "But you did not destroy the red tie," said he, with a smile. "You tore up your blue one. Look, there it is on the floor. The red one you still have on." Investigation showed the truth of my visitor's assertion. That flaunting streamer of anarchy still made my neck infamous, and before me on the floor, an almost unrecognizable mass of shreds, lay my cherished cerulean tie. The revelation stunned me. Tears came into my eyes and, trickling down over my cheeks, fairly hissed with the feverish heat of my flesh. My muscles relaxed, and I fell limp into my chair. "You need stimulant," said my visitor kindly. "Go take a drop of your old reserve, and then come back here to me. I've something to say to you." "Will you join me?" I asked faintly. "No," returned the visitor. "I am so fond of whiskey that I never molest it. That act which is your stimulant is death to the rye. Never realized that, did you?" "No, I never did," I said meekly. "And yet you claim to love it. Ha!" he said. And then I obeyed his command, drained my glass to the dregs, and returned. "What is your mission?" I asked when I had made myself as comfortable as was possible under the circumstances. "To relieve you of your woes," he said. "You are a homeopath, I observe," said I with a sneer. "You are a homeopath in theory and an allopath in practice." "I'm not unusually unintelligent," said he. "I fail to comprehend your meaning. Perhaps you express yourself badly." "I wish you'd express yourself for Zululand," I retorted hotly. "What I mean is, you believe in the similia similibus business, but you prescribe large doses. I don't believe troubles like mine can be cured on your plan. A man can't get rid of his stock by adding to it." "Ah, I see. You think I have added to your troubles." "I don't think so," I answered with a fond glass at my ruined tie. "I know so." "Well, wait until I have laid my plan before you, and see if you won't change your mind," said my visitor significantly. "All right," said I. "Proceed. Only hurry. I go to bed early as a rule, and it's getting quite early now." "It's only 1 o'clock," said the visitor, ignoring the sarcasm. But I will hasten, as I've several other calls to make before breakfast. Are you a milkman? I asked. You are flippant, he replied. But, Haram, he added, I have come here to aid you in spite of your unworthiness. You want to know what to provide for your club on the 15th. You want something that will knock the martyr's night silly. Not exactly that, I replied. I don't want anything so abominably good as to make all the other things I have done seem failures. That is not good business. Would you like to be hailed as the discoverer of genius? Would you like to be responsible for the greatest exhibition of skill in a certain direction ever seen? Would you like to become the most famous impresario the world has ever known? Now, I said, forgetting my dignity under the enthusiasm with which I was inspired by my visitor's words, and infected more or less with his undoubtedly magnetite spirit. Now you're shouting. I thought so, Haram. I thought so, and that's why I am here. I saw you on Wall Street today and read your difficulty at once in your eyes. And I resolved to help you. I am a magician, and one or two little things have happened of late to make me wish to prestidigitate in public. I knew you were after a show of some kind, and I've come to offer you my services. Oh, psh! I said. The members of the Gutenberg Club are men of brains, not children. Card tricks are hackneyed, and sleight of hand shows Paul. Do they indeed? Said the visitor. Well, mine won't. If you don't believe it, I'll prove to you what I can do. I have no paraphernalia, I said. Well, I have, said he, and as he spoke, a pack of cards seemed to grow out of my hands. I must have turned pale at this unexpected happening, for my visitor smiled and said, Don't be frightened. That's only one of my tricks. Now, choose a card, he added, and when you have done so, toss the pack in the air. Don't tell me what the card is. It alone will fall to the floor. Nonsense, said I. It's impossible. Do as I tell you. I did as he told me, to a degree only. I tossed the cards in the air without choosing one, although I made a feint of doing so. Not a card fell back to the floor. They every one disappeared from view into the ceiling. If it had not been for the heavy chair I had rolled in front of the door, I think I should have fled. How's that for a trick? Asked my visitor. I said nothing, for the very good reason that my words stuck in my throat. Give me a little creme de menthe, will you please? Said he, after a moment's pause. I haven't a drop in the house, I said, relieved to think that this wonderful being could come down to anything so earthly. Tcha, Haram, he ejaculated, apparently in disgust. Don't be mean, and above all, don't lie. Why, man, you've got a bottle full in your hand. Do you want it all? He was right. Where it came from, I do not know, but beyond question, the graceful, slim-necked bottle was in my right hand, and my left held a liqueur glass of exquisite form. Say, I gasped as soon as I was able to collect my thoughts. What are your terms? Wait a minute, he answered. Let me do a little mind reading before we arrange preliminaries. I haven't much of a mind to read tonight, I answered wildly. You're right there, said he. It's like a dime novel, that mind of yours tonight. But I'll do the best I can with it. Suppose you think of your favorite poem, and after turning it over in your mind carefully for a few minutes, selecting 2 lines from it, concealing them, of course, from me, and I will tell you what they are. Now, my favorite poem, I regret to say, is Lewis Carroll's Jabberwock. A fact I was ashamed to confess to an utter stranger, so I tried to deceive him by thinking of some other lines. The effort was hardly successful, for the only other lines I could call to mind at the moment were from Rudyard Kipling's rhyme, The Post That Fitted, and which ran, Year by year, in pious patience, vengeful Mrs. Boffin sits, waiting for the Sleary babies to develop Sleary's fits. Huh! Ejaculated my visitor. You're great, Haram. You are. And then, rising from his chair and walking to my poet's corner, the magician selected 2 volumes. There, said he, handing me the departmental ditties. You'll find the lines you tried to fool me with at the foot of page 13. Look. I looked, and there lay that vile Sleary sentiment in all the majesty of type, staring me in the eyes. And here, added my visitor, opening Alice in the Looking Glass, there you will find the poem to your mind holds all the philosophy of life. Come to my arms, my beamish boy, he chortled in his joy. I blushed and trembled, blushed that he should discover the weakness of my taste, trembled at his power. I don't blame you for coloring, said the magician, but I thought you said the Gutenberg was made up of men and brains. Do you think you could stay on the rolls a month if they were aware that your poetic ideals were summed up in the Jabberwock and Sleary's fits? My taste might be far worse, I answered. Yes, it might. You might have stooped to liking some of your own verses. I ought really to congratulate you, I suppose, retorted the visitor with a sneering laugh. This roused my ire again. Who are you, anyhow, that you come here and take me to task? I demanded angrily. I'll like anything I please, and without asking your permission. If I cared more for the Peterkin papers than I do for Shakespeare, I wouldn't be accountable to you. And that's all there is about it. Never mind who I am, said the visitor. Suffice to say that I am myself. You'll know my name soon enough. In fact, you will pronounce it involuntarily the first thing when you wake up in the morning. And then, here, he shook his head ominously, and I felt myself grow rigid with fright in my chair. Now for the final trick, he said. Think of where you would most like to be at this moment, and I'll exert my power to put you there. Only first, close your eyes. I closed my eyes and wished. When I opened them, I was in the billiard room of the Gutenberg Club with Perkins and Thompson. For heaven's sake, Spencer, they said in surprise, where did you drop in from? And why, man, are you as white as a sheet? And what a necktie! Take it off! Grab hold of me, boys, and hold me fast, I pleaded, falling on my knees. If you don't, I believe I'll die. The idea of returning to my sanctum was intolerably dreadful to me. Ha ha! Laughed the magician. For even as I spoke to Perkins and Thompson, I found myself seated opposite my infernal visitor in my room once more. They couldn't keep you an instant with me summoning you back. His laughter was terrible. His frown was pleasanter, and I felt myself gradually losing control of my senses. Go! I cried. Leave me, or you will have the crime of murder on your conscience. I have no he began, but I heard no more. That is the last I remember of that fearful night. I must have fainted, and then have fallen into a deep slumber. When I waked, it was morning, and I was alone, but undressed and in bed, unconscionably weak, and surrounded by medicine bottles of many kinds. The clock on the mantel on the other side of the room indicated that it was after 10 o'clock. Great Beelzebub! I cried, taking note of the hour. I've an engagement with Barlow at 9! And then a sweet-faced woman, who, I afterwards learned, was a professional nurse, entered the room, and within an hour I realized two facts. One was that I had lain ill for many days, and that my engagement with Barlow was now for 6 weeks unfulfilled. The other, that my midnight visitor was none other than. And yet, I don't know. His tricks were worthy of that individual, certainly. But Perkins and Thompson assert that I never entered the club that night. And surely, if my visitor was Beelzebub himself, he would not have omitted so important a factor of success as my actual presence in the billiard room on that occasion would have been. And besides, he was altogether too cool to come from his reputed residence. Altogether, I think the episode most unaccountable, particularly when I reflect that while no trace of my visitor was discoverable in my room the next morning, as my nurse tells me, my blue necktie was in reality found upon the floor, crushed and torn into a shapeless bundle of frayed rags. As for the club entertainment, I am told that, despite my absence, it was a wonderful success. Redeemed from failure, the treasurer of the club said, by the voluntary services of a guest who secured admittance on one of my cards and who executed some sleight of hand tricks that made the members tremble, and whose mind-reading feats performed on the club's butler not only made it necessary for him to resign his office, but disclosed to the House Committee the whereabouts of several cases of rare wines that had mysteriously disappeared. Now we have the water ghost of Harrowby Hall. The trouble with Harrowby Hall was that it was haunted. And what was worse, the ghost did not content itself with merely appearing at the bedside of the afflicted person who saw it, but persisted in remaining there for 1 mortal hour before it would disappear. It never appeared except on Christmas Eve. And then, as the clock was striking 12, in which respect alone was it lacking in that originality, which in these days is a sine qua non of success in spectral life. The owners of Harrowby Hall had done their utmost to rid themselves of the damp and dewy lady who rose up out of the best bedroom floor at midnight, but without avail. They had tried stopping the clock so that the ghost would not know when it was midnight. but she made her appearance just the same, with that fearful, miasmic personality of hers. And there she would stand until everything about her was thoroughly saturated. Then the owners of Harrowby Hall caulked up every crack in the floor with the very best quality of hemp, and over this was placed layers of tar and canvas. The walls were made waterproof, and the doors and windows likewise. The proprietors having conceived the notion that the unexercised lady would find it difficult to leak into the room after these precautions had been taken. But even this did not suffice. The following Christmas Eve, she appeared as promptly as before, and frightened the occupant of the room quite out of his senses by sitting down alongside of him and gazing with her cavernous blue eyes into his. And he noticed, too, that in her long, aqueously bony fingers, bits of dripping seaweed were entwined, the ends hanging down, and these ends she drew across his forehead until he became like one insane. And then he swooned away and was found unconscious in his bed the next morning by his host, simply saturated with seawater and fright, from the combined effects of which he never recovered, dying 4 years later of pneumonia and nervous prostration at the age of 78. The next year, the master of Harrowby Hall decided not to have the best square bedroom opened at all, thinking that perhaps the ghost's thirst for making herself disagreeable would be satisfied by haunting the furniture. But the plan was as unavailing as the many that had preceded it. The ghost appeared as usual in the room. That is, it was supposed she did, for the hangings were dripping wet the next morning, and in the parlor below the haunted room, a great damp spot appeared in the ceiling. Finding no one there, she immediately set out to learn the reason why, and she chose none other than to haunt the owner of the Harrowby himself. She found him in his own cozy room drinking whiskey undiluted, and felicitating himself upon having foiled her ghostship, when all of a sudden the curl went out of his hair. His whiskey bottle filled and overflowed, and he was himself in a condition similar to that of a man who has fallen into a water butt. When he recovered from the shock, which was a painful one, he saw before him the lady of the cavernous eyes and seaweed fingers. The sight was so unexpected and so terrifying that he fainted, but immediately came to, because of the vast amount of water in his hair, which, trickling down over his face, restored his consciousness. Now it so happened that the master of Harrowby was a brave man, and while he was not particularly fond of interviewing ghosts, especially such quenching ghosts as the one before him, he was not to be daunted by an apparition. He had paid the lady the compliment of fainting from the effects of his first surprise, and now that he had come to, he intended to find out a few things he felt he had the right to know. He would have liked to put on a dry suit of clothes first, but the apparition declined to leave him for an instant until her hour was up, and he was forced to deny himself that pleasure. Every time he would move, she would follow him, with the result that everything she came in contact with got a ducking. In an effort to warm himself up, he approached the fire. An unfortunate move, it turned out, because it brought the ghost directly over the fire, which was immediately then extinguished. The whiskey became utterly valueless as a comforter to his chilled system, because it was, by this time, diluted to a proportion of 90% water. The only thing he could do to ward off the evil effects of his encounter, he did. And that was to swallow 2 grain quinine pills, which he managed to put into his mouth before the ghost had time to interfere. Having done this, he turned with some asperity to the ghost and said, "Far be it from me to be impolite to a woman, madam, but I'm hanged of it. Wouldn't it be please me better if you'd stop these infernal visits of yours to this house? Go sit out on the lake if you like that sort of thing. Soak the water butt if you wish, but do not, I implore you, come into a gentleman's house and saturate him and his possessions in this way. It is damned disagreeable." "Henry Hartwick Olginthorpe," said the ghost in a gurgling voice. "You don't know what you are talking about." "Madam," returned the unhappy householder, "I wish that remark were strictly truthful. I was talking about you. It would be shillings and pence, nay, pounds, in my pocket, madam, if I did not know you." "That is a bit of specious nonsense," returned the ghost, throwing a quart of indignation into the face of the master of Harrowby. "It may rank high as repartee, but as a comment upon my statement that you do not know what you are talking about, it savors of irrelevance, impertinence even. You do not know that I am compelled to haunt this place year after year by inexorable fate. It is no pleasure to me to enter this house and ruin and mildew everything I touch. I never aspired to be a shower bath, but it is my doom. Do you know who I am?" "No, I don't," returned the master of Harrowby. "I should say you were the Lady of the Lake, or Little Sally Waters." "You are a witty man, for your years," said the ghost. "Well, my humor is drier than yours ever will be," returned the master. "No doubt. I'm never dry. I am the water ghost of Harrowby Hall, and dryness is a quality entirely beyond my wildest hope. I have been the incumbent of this highly unpleasant office for 200 years tonight." "How the deuce did you ever come to get elected?" asked the master. "Through suicide," replied the spectre. "I'm the ghost of that fair maiden whose picture hangs over the mantelpiece in the drawing-room. I should have been your great-great-great-great-aunt if I had lived, Henry Hartwick Orkenthrope, for I was the own sister of your great-great-great-grandfather." "But what induced you to get this house into such a predicament?" "I was not to blame, sir," returned the lady. "It was my father's fault. He it was who built Harrowby Hall, and the haunted chamber was to have been mine. My father had it furnished in pink and yellow, knowing well that blue and gray formed the only combination of color I could tolerate. He did it merely to spite me, and with what I deem a proper spirit, I declined to live in the room, whereupon my father said I could live there or on the lawn. He didn't care which. That night I ran from the house and jumped over the cliff into the sea." "That was rash," said the master of Harrowby. "So I've learned," returned the ghost. "If I had known what the consequences were to be, I should not have jumped. But I never really realized what I was doing until after I was drowned. I had been drowned a week when a sea nymph came to me and informed me that I was to be one of her followers forever afterwards, adding that it should be my doom to haunt Harrowby. She said I must haunt the hall for 1 hour every Christmas Eve throughout the rest of eternity. I was to haunt that room as I had found it uninhabitable. And if it should turn out not to be inhabited by the living, I was and am to spend the allotted hour with the head of the house. I'll sell the place. That you cannot do, for it is also required of me that I shall appear as the deeds are to be delivered to any purchaser and divulge to him the awful secret of the house. Do you mean to tell me that on every Christmas Eve that I don't happen to have somebody in that guest chamber, you are going to haunt me wherever I may be, ruining my whiskey, taking all the curl out of my hair, extinguishing my fire, and soaking me through to the skin? Demanded the master. You have stated the case, Oglethorpe. And what is more, said the water ghost, it doesn't make the slightest difference where you are. If I find that room empty, wherever you may be, I shall douse you with my spectral Here the clock struck 1, and immediately the apparition failed away. It was perhaps more of a trickle than a fade, but as a disappearance, it was complete. By St. George and his dragon! Ejaculated the master of Harrowby, wringing his hands. It is Guinness to hot cross buns that next Christmas there's an occupant of the spare room, or I shall spend the night in a bathtub. But the master of Harrowby would have lost his wager had there been anyone there to take him up. For when Christmas Eve came again, he was in his grave, never having recovered from the cold contracted that awful night. Harrowby Hall was closed, and the heir to the estate was in London, where to him, in his chambers, came the same experience that his father had gone through, saving only that being younger and stronger, he survived the shock. Everything in his rooms was ruined. His clocks were rusted in the works. A fine collection of watercolor drawings was entirely obliterated by the onslaught of the water ghost. And what was worse, the apartments below his were drenched with the water soaking through the floors, a damage for which he was compelled to pay, and which resulted in his being requested by his landlady to vacate the premises immediately. The story of the visitation upon his family had gone abroad, and no one could be got to invite him out to any function save afternoon teas and receptions. Fathers of daughters declined to permit him to remain in their houses later than 8 o'clock at night, not knowing but that some emergency might arise in the supernatural world which would require the unexpected appearance of the water ghost in this on nights other than Christmas Eve. And before the mystic hour, when weary churchyards, ignoring the rules which are supposed to govern polite society, begin to yawn. Nor would the maids themselves have aught to do with him, fearing the destruction of the sudden incursion of aqueous femininity of the costumes which they held most dear. So the heir of Harrowby Hall resolved, as his ancestors for several generations before him had resolved, that something must be done. His first thought was to make one of his servants occupy the haunted room at the crucial moment. But in this he failed, because the servants themselves knew the history of that room and rebelled. None of his friends would consent to sacrifice their personal comfort to his, nor was there to be found in all of England a man so poor as to be willing to occupy the doomed chamber on Christmas Eve for pay. Then the thought came to the heir to have the fireplace in the room enlarged, so that he might evaporate the ghost at its first appearance. And he was felicitating himself upon the ingenuity of his plan when he remembered that his father had told him how that no fire could withstand the lady's extremely contagious dampness. And then he bethought him of steam pipes. These, he remembered, could lie hundreds of feet deep in water and still retain sufficient heat to drive the water away in vapor. And as a result of this, thought the haunted room was heated by steam to a withering degree, and the heir for 6 months attended daily the Turkish baths, so that when Christmas Eve came, he could himself withstand the awful temperature of the room. The scheme was only partially successful. The water ghost appeared at the specified time and found the heir of Harrowby prepared. But hot as the room was, it shortened her visit by no more than 5 minutes in the hour, during which time the nervous system of the young master was well nigh shattered, and the room itself was cracked and warped to an extent which required the outlay of a large sum of money to remedy. And worse than this, as the last drop of the water ghost was slowly sizzling itself out on the floor, she whispered to her would-be conqueror that his scheme would avail him nothing, because there was still water in great plenty where she came from, and that next year would find her rehabilitated and as exasperatingly saturating as ever. It was then that the natural action of the mind, in going from one extreme to the other, suggested to the ingenious heir of Harrowby the means by which the water ghost was ultimately conquered, and happiness once more came within the grasp of the house of Oglethorpe. The heir provided himself with a warm suit of fur underclothing. Donning this with the furry side in, he placed it over a rubber garment, tight-fitting, which he wore just as a woman wears a jersey. On top of this, he placed another set of underclothing, this suit made of wool, and over this was a second rubber garment like the first. Upon this, he placed a light and comfortable diving helmet, and so clad on the following Christmas Eve, he awaited the coming of his tormentor. It was a bitterly cold night that brought to a close this 24th day of December. The air outside was still, but the temperature was below 0. Within all was quiet, the servants of Harrowby Hall awaiting with beating hearts the outcome of their master's campaign against his supernatural visitor. The master himself was lying on the bed in the haunted room, clad as he had already been indicated, and then the clock clanged out the hour of 12. There was a sudden banging of doors. A blast of cold air swept through the halls. The door leading into the haunted chamber flew open. A splash was heard, and the water ghost was seen standing at the side of the heir of Harrowby, from whose outer dress there streamed rivulets of water, but whose own person, deep down under the various garments, was as dry and as warm as he could have wished. "Ha!" said the young master of Harrowby. "I'm glad to see you." "You're the most original man I've met, if that is true," returned the ghost. "May I ask, where did you get that hat?" "Certainly, madam," returned the master courteously. "It is a little portable observatory I had made just for such emergencies as this. But tell me, is it true that you are doomed to follow me about for one mortal hour, to stand where I stand, to sit where I sit?" "That is my delectable fate," returned the lady. "Well, we'll go out on the lake," said the master, starting up. "You can't get rid of me that way," returned the ghost. The water won't swallow me up. In fact, it will just add to my present bulk. Nevertheless, said the master firmly, we will go out on the lake. But, my dearest sir, returned the ghost with a pale reluctance, it is fearfully cold out there. You will be frozen hard before you've been out 10 minutes. Oh, no, I'll not, replied the master. I am very warmly dressed. Come. This last in a tone of command that made the ghost ripple. As they started, they had not gone far before the water ghost showed signs of distress. You walk too slowly, she said. I am nearly frozen. My knees are so stiff I can hardly move. I beseech you to accelerate your step. I should like to oblige, a lady, returned the master courteously, but my clothes are rather heavy, and 100 yards an hour is about my speed. Indeed, I think we would better sit down here on this snowdrift and talk matters over. Do not so, I beg, cried the ghost. Let me move on. I feel myself growing rigid as it is. If we stop here, I shall be frozen stiff. That, madam, said the master slowly, and seating himself on an ice cake, that is why I have brought you here. We have been on this spot just 10 minutes. We have 50 more. Take your time about it, madam, but freeze. That is all I ask of you. I cannot move my right leg now, cried the ghost in despair, and my overskirt is a solid sheet of ice. Oh, good, kind Mr. Oglethorpe, light a fire, and let me go free from these icy fetters. Never, madam. It cannot be. I have you at last. Alas, cried the ghost, a tear trickling down her frozen cheek. Help me, I beg, I congeal. Congeal, madam, congeal, returned Oglethorpe coldly. You have drenched me and mine for 203 years, madam. Tonight, you have had your last drench. Ah, but I shall thaw out again, and then you'll see, instead of the comfortably tepid, genial ghost I have been in my past, sir, I shall be iced water, cried the lady threateningly. No, you won't either, returned Oglethorpe. For when you are frozen quite stiff, I shall send you to a cold storage warehouse, and there shall you remain an icy work of art forevermore. But warehouses burn. So they do. But this warehouse cannot burn. It is made of asbestos, and surrounding it are fireproof walls. And within those walls, the temperature is now and shall ever be 416 degrees below the 0 point. Low enough to make an icicle of any flame in this world or the next, the master added with an ill-suppressed chuckle. For the last time, let me beseech you. I would go on knees to you, Oglethorpe. Were they not already frozen? I beg of you, do not do. Here, even the words froze on the water ghost's lips, and the clock struck 1. There was a momentary tremor throughout the icebound form, and the moon, coming out from behind a cloud, shone down on the rigid figure of a beautiful woman sculptured in clear, transparent ice. There stood the ghost of Harrowby Hall, conquered by the cold, a prisoner for all time. The heir of Harrowby had won at last, and today, in a large storage house in London, stands the frigid form of one who will never again flood the house of Oglethorpe with woe and seawater. As for the heir of Harrowby, his success in coping with a ghost has made him famous, a fame that still lingers about him, although his victory took place some 20 years ago, and so far from being unpopular with the fair sex, as he was when we first knew him. He has not only been married twice, but is led a third bride to the altar before the year is out. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Living Pages. I hope to see you next time, and stay safe out there.